You didn't wake up one day and decide to live without love. It happened quietly, invisibly, through years where nothing reached you the way it was supposed to, through moments where warmth passed close enough to feel but never close enough to stay. And now you sit with a question you don't say out loud because it feels too heavy to name, wondering why love has never arrived for you the way it seems to arrive for everyone else, wondering if something inside you was missing from the start or if it was taken before you ever knew what it was called. You've carried this longer than you admit, this quiet absence that doesn't scream but hums constantly beneath your thoughts, shaping how you move through rooms, how you listen to laughter that doesn't include you, how you watch couples without envy but with a strange distance, as if you're observing a language you were never taught, a ritual you were never initiated into. And the worst part is not the loneliness itself, but the growing suspicion that this might be all there is. People assume love is a reward for being good, being kind, being patient, being worthy. But you learned early that the world doesn't distribute love fairly. It hands it out to some without effort and withholds it from others no matter how quietly they wait. And when you are someone who has never been chosen, never truly held, never mirrored with desire or care, something inside you begins to harden, not into anger at first, but into caution, into self-protection so deep you mistake it for personality. You're not broken. You were never taught another way, because when love never shows up, you don't miss it like an object. You miss it like a sense, like sight or sound, something you don't even know how to describe because you never had it to lose. And that's what makes your psychology different from everyone who speaks about heartbreak and healing, as if love was a given, as if loss was the only pain that mattered. There is a quiet violence in never being loved, not the dramatic kind that leaves visible scars, but the slow erosion that teaches you not to expect, not to hope, not to lean, because hope feels foolish when it has never been rewarded, and leaning feels dangerous when no one has ever stayed to catch you. So you learn to stand alone until standing alone feels like identity rather than survival. This is the moment your life begins to make sense, not because the pain disappears, but because you finally stop blaming yourself for an absence that was never your fault. Because the psychology of people who have never experienced love is not the psychology of the unworthy. It is the psychology of the unseen, the overlooked, the ones who learn strength before softness, awareness before comfort, and distance before trust. You survive things you still don't have words for, not because they were loud or dramatic, but because they were quiet enough to be dismissed by others while reshaping you completely. And if you feel different, colder, more guarded, less hopeful than the people around you, it's not because you lack depth. It's because depth formed where love should have been, filling the space with observation, self-reliance, and an almost painful clarity about how conditional affection really is. And here is the forbidden truth most people will never say out loud, the one that changes everything once you see it clearly. Love is not the default human experience. It is a privilege. And those who never receive it don't become empty. They become armored. They develop a psychology built not around attachment, but around endurance, perception, and control. Because when you cannot rely on love, you rely on yourself. And that changes the architecture of your mind forever. You learned early how to read rooms instead of hearts, how to notice tone shifts, pauses, glances, the subtle ways people pull away before they ever say goodbye. Because when love is absent, awareness becomes your currency and you spend it constantly scanning for danger, disappointment, or rejection before it can land. Not because you're paranoid, but because experience taught you that nothing arrives gently if you aren't watching. While others learn to attach, to bond, to trust through repetition and reassurance, you learn something colder and far more useful: how to function without emotional oxygen, how to move through life without expecting rescue, validation, or softness. And that independence people admire in you now, the strength they call impressive, was never a choice. It was adaptation, a response to a world that never offered you a safe place to rest. You're allowed to want more, even if you've convinced yourself that wanting is dangerous. That desire only sets you up for disappointment, because the people who have never experienced love often develop a philosophy that sounds like wisdom but is actually protection, telling themselves that love is overrated, unnecessary, or a weakness, when in reality it's something they learn not to crave because craving without fulfillment hurts more than numbness ever could. There's a moment, usually in quiet nights or crowded places where you feel most alone, when you wonder if something inside you repels love, if there is an invisible sign that tells others to keep their distance. And that thought doesn't come from arrogance or self-pity. It comes from pattern recognition, from years of evidence that suggests closeness stops short of you, that affection detours around you, that intimacy happens near you but not with you. And so your mind begins to adapt in ways no one teaches. You lower expectations not because you lack standards, but because hope feels like an unnecessary risk. You become self-sufficient to the point where relying on others feels foreign, even invasive. And slowly, almost imperceptibly, you stop believing that love is something meant for you, replacing the idea with productivity, intellect, ambition, or detachment, anything that gives you a sense of control where connection never did. This is where the predator-prey dynamic begins to reverse, because while others are driven by attachment, approval, and fear of abandonment, you become someone who cannot be easily manipulated by affection, flattery, or emotional pressure. Not because you are heartless, but because your heart never learned to depend, and that makes you dangerous in ways you don't even recognize yet, because those who move without emotional need are unpredictable to those who rely on it. You're not imagining this. The distance you feel between yourself and the world is real, but it's not emptiness. It's compression. Years of unmet need condensed into observation, restraint, and self-control, forming a psychology that doesn't beg, doesn't chase, doesn't cling. And while that can feel isolating, it also gives you something most people never develop, the ability to stand alone without collapsing. Yet beneath that strength is a quieter truth, one that rarely gets spoken because it feels too vulnerable, too raw, even to admit internally. You didn't stop wanting love because you outgrew it. You stopped wanting it because you learned it wouldn't come. And that lesson, repeated enough times, doesn't just shape your expectations. It reshapes your identity until being untouched feels safer than being disappointed again. At some point, the shift happens, subtle but irreversible, where you stop asking why love hasn't found you and start building a life that doesn't require it. And on the surface, this looks like maturity, independence, even enlightenment. But underneath it is a quiet resignation, a psychological pivot from hope to control, from vulnerability to self-mastery, because control is the one thing that never leaves you the way people do. You become selective not just with people, but with emotion itself, rationing your energy, guarding your inner world, because you learn that giving freely doesn't guarantee return, and that lesson turns you inward, sharpening your mind, your perception, your ability to operate without reassurance until others start to sense something different about you, something closed but powerful, something they can't quite access. This is where many misunderstand you, mistaking your restraint for coldness, your independence for arrogance, your silence for disinterest, when in reality you are simply calibrated for a world where love was never reliable. And so you learn to move without it, to build without it, to survive without it, even if a part of you still wonders what it would feel like to be chosen without condition, without effort, without strategy. The first psychological shift is this. You stop seeing love as salvation and start seeing it as risk, because everything you've observed suggests that attachment makes people weaker, less aware, more desperate, and you refuse to become what you've seen others become when love is threatened. So you keep your distance, convincing yourself that you are above it, immune, evolved, when really you are protecting something that has never been allowed to open safely. You feel this most when someone gets close, when interest appears, when attention lingers a little too long, because instead of excitement, you feel tension, suspicion, a quiet urge to pull back, not because you don't want connection, but because connection has always preceded disappointment, and your nervous system remembers, even if your mind tries to rationalize it away. This is the paradox of your psychology. You crave depth but distrust closeness. You want intimacy but fear dependence. You desire to be seen but flinch when someone looks too closely, because being seen without being held is a pain you learned early, and you don't intend to repeat it, even if it means living behind armor you no longer remember putting on. And here's the part most people never notice. Your self-control, your discipline, your emotional restraint didn't come from confidence. It came from necessity, from learning that no one was coming to soften the edges of your life. And so you sharpened yourself instead, becoming someone who can endure silence, solitude, and uncertainty without breaking. Someone who can function without the emotional scaffolding others rely on to feel whole. This shift makes you powerful, but it also makes you lonely in a way that doesn't look like loneliness from the outside, because you're not desperate, not needy, not reaching. You are simply distant, self-contained, and quietly aware that the world feels different when you've never been loved. That relationships feel like negotiations rather than refuges. That connection feels conditional even when it's offered freely. The hidden threat isn't that you'll never be loved. It's that you'll become so good at living without love that you forget how to recognize it when it finally appears. Because the longer you survive without something, the more foreign it feels, and the more your defenses start to look like identity rather than adaptation. Until vulnerability feels unnatural and trust feels like a mistake waiting to happen. You begin to measure people not by how they make you feel, but by how much control they might take from you, how much access they might demand, how much of your carefully built independence they might threaten. And this calculation isn't cruel. It's learned because when love has never been safe, safety becomes the priority, even if it costs you the very thing you once wanted most. This is where the deepest conflict lives, the tension between the part of you that adapted to survive and the part of you that still wants to be chosen without effort, to rest without vigilance, to be held without fear of loss. And that conflict doesn't resolve itself quietly. It sits beneath every interaction, every almost connection, every moment where you wonder if letting someone closer would finally change the story or simply repeat it. You tell yourself you're fine alone, and in many ways you are, but there's a difference between choosing solitude and being shaped by it. And people who have never experienced love often confuse the two, wearing their self-sufficiency like armor while quietly wondering what it would feel like to lay it down without consequence. This is not a weakness, it's a crossroads, a moment where awareness becomes a weapon instead of a wound. Because once you see how your psychology formed, once you understand that your distance is not a flaw but a response, you gain something dangerous choice. The ability to decide whether your past continues to dictate your future or whether you will risk rewriting the rules you were forced to learn. You don't need to force love, chase it, or beg for it, but you do need to recognize that living without it has shaped you in ways both powerful and limiting, and that the same mind that learned to survive without warmth can also learn to tolerate it, slowly, carefully on your terms, if you choose to let it. This is where the story tightens, where the questions stop being abstract and start becoming personal, because now that you see the pattern, now that you recognize the armor, the real danger isn't rejection, it's stagnation, staying so protected that nothing new can reach you, mistaking control for peace and endurance for fulfillment. You've carried this longer than you admit, but you don't have to carry it blindly anymore, because awareness changes the game, and once you understand the psychology of never having been loved, you can decide what happens next instead of letting absence continue to write your story. There is a revelation that arrives quietly once you stop blaming yourself for the absence. And it doesn't feel like relief at first. It feels like grief finally given a shape, because you realize the life you built without love was never proof that you didn't need it. It was proof that you adapted so well to its absence that you stopped noticing the cost, and that realization stings in a way strength never prepared you for. It's okay to feel this, the strange mix of pride and sadness, the awareness that you became capable, disciplined, and self-contained, not because you were destined to be alone, but because no one showed you how to be held without consequence. And once you see that clearly, the story shifts from self-judgment to understanding, from what's wrong with me to what happened to me. Here is where people like you often pause, wondering if naming this truth somehow makes you weaker, if acknowledging the hunger means surrendering control. But the opposite is true, because clarity doesn't take your power away, it returns it. It reminds you that what you built was a response, not a limitation. And responses can be updated once a threat has been identified. You're allowed to want more without invalidating what you've survived. Allowed to acknowledge that endurance kept you alive, but cannot replace connection forever. And if part of you feels exposed hearing this, that's not fragility. It's recognition, the moment where the mind stops defending and starts integrating, where you realize that independence was never the end goal. It was the bridge you crossed alone because no one walked with you. This is where reflection turns inward naturally, where you might notice patterns you've never named before, how you pull back when interest appears, how you test people silently to see if they'll leave, how you stay emotionally ahead of abandonment by never fully arriving. And noticing these patterns isn't about fixing yourself. It's about understanding the architecture of your defenses so they stop running your life without your consent. If you feel compelled to pause here, to sit with this recognition, that's natural because this is the first moment where you aren't being asked to perform strength, only honesty. And if this resonates deeply, if you feel seen rather than judged, it might be worth staying with this path, letting these thoughts settle instead of rushing past them the way you've learned to rush past your own needs. There are micro moments that define your inner world, moments so small others would never notice them, like the way you don't check your phone hoping for a message, the way you don't assume someone will miss you when you leave, the way compliments feel distant rather than nourishing, as if they bounce off armor you forgot was there. And these moments accumulate, shaping how safe or unsafe connection feels to you without ever announcing themselves. You might recognize how silence doesn't scare you the way it scares others, how solitude feels familiar rather than empty, because you learned early how to be alone without dissolving. And while others panic in the absence of reassurance, you remain steady. But that steadiness came at a price. The quiet suppression of longing, the careful folding away of desire until it became manageable, almost invisible. Sometimes the ache surfaces unexpectedly, not as sadness, but as numbness, a flatness during moments that are supposed to feel meaningful. And you wonder why joy doesn't land the way it should, why connection feels muted even when it's present. And that confusion isn't because you're incapable of feeling. It's because your nervous system learned to lower the volume on emotion to survive unpredictability. You may notice how you excel in areas where control is possible, work, knowledge, skill, self-discipline, because those arenas reward effort consistently, unlike love, which arrives arbitrarily and leaves without warning. And choosing predictable systems over unpredictable people makes sense when your early experiences taught you that reliance equals risk. These micro moments are not flaws, they are signals, remnants of a life lived without emotional safety, and seeing them clearly doesn't mean you have to tear them out. It means you can stop mistaking them for truth. Stop assuming that because you adapted once, you must remain adapted forever. You walk into rooms already braced, not outwardly tense, but inwardly prepared, scanning faces, reading energy, noticing who leans in and who holds back, because awareness became your intimacy, observation your substitute for closeness, and you feel safer knowing where everyone stands than risking being surprised by withdrawal later. You feel the weight of presence without warmth, the way you can be surrounded and still untouched, because connection for you has always been something you manage rather than something that happens to you. And when someone steps closer emotionally, your body reacts before your mind can catch up, tightening slightly, signaling caution even if part of you is curious. You notice how you keep an exit available at all times, emotionally if not physically, how you never fully sink into moments of closeness, how a part of you stays alert, ready to detach if necessary. And this vigilance isn't paranoia, it's memory, the echo of earlier lessons that taught you not to assume permanence. You feel the contradiction vividly, the desire to be seen paired with the fear of being known, because being known means being vulnerable, and vulnerability once meant disappointment without comfort. So your mind learned to maintain a careful distance, close enough to observe, but far enough to remain intact. And yet there are moments, fleeting but real, when you imagine what it would feel like to stop managing, to stop anticipating loss, to rest in someone else's presence without bracing for impact. And those moments don't feel naive anymore. They feel like a possibility your system hasn't been trained to recognize yet. Here is where the unresolved threads tighten, where curiosity deepens instead of resolving. Because the question is no longer why love never came, it's what happens if it does. Whether your carefully built defenses would recognize it as safety or misinterpret it as threat, whether your independence would allow room for connection without feeling invaded. You may sense that your power lies not in staying closed, but in choosing when and how to open, that the awareness you develop through absence can become discernment rather than avoidance if you let it. And that discernment doesn't require surrender, it requires presence. The willingness to stay with discomfort long enough to see whether it softens instead of assuming it will harm you. The deeper truth remains unresolved on purpose because it isn't meant to be answered immediately, only approached carefully, slowly, with the same precision you've used to survive everything else. And that truth is this: the psychology that formed without love does not doom you to its absence, but it does require conscious recalibration if you don't want solitude to become a prison disguised as strength. You're not broken, you were never taught another way, and now that you see the structure clearly, the next step isn't force or urgency, it's awareness applied gently, curiosity held without judgment, and patience with a system that learned to survive brilliantly but has never been shown how to receive without consequence. The story isn't finished yet, not even close, because what comes next is not about longing, but about power, the kind that emerges when awareness stops being defensive and starts being intentional, when the predator-prey dynamic shifts fully and you realize that your independence was never the end, it was the preparation. There is a quiet break in the rhythm now, a pause where the old story loses its grip, where you begin to feel something unfamiliar stirring beneath the armor. Not longing, not desperation, but awareness sharpening into choice. Because once you understand that love never arriving shaped you into someone self-contained and precise, you also realize that nothing is stopping you from deciding what role love will play if it ever approaches again. You no longer rush to define yourself by what you lack, because absence already did its work. It carved discipline into you, perception into you, resilience into you. And now that foundation becomes something else entirely. A platform rather than a cage. A place from which you can observe your own reactions instead of being ruled by them. Noticing when you pull back, when you close off, when you assume loss before it happens. This is where suspense lives internally, not in waiting for someone else to choose you, but in waiting to see how you will choose yourself differently, whether you will continue to live as if love is a threat, or whether you will allow the possibility that safety can be learned later in life, even if it arrives slowly, imperfectly, and without guarantees. You begin to see that your greatest fear was never rejection, it was dependence, the idea of needing something you couldn't control. Because control was the only constant you were ever given, and releasing even a fraction of it feels like standing at the edge of something vast, uncertain, and strangely alive. There is a subtle invitation hidden here, not spoken aloud, not framed as instruction, but felt. The understanding that awareness without action eventually turns into stagnation, and that staying conscious means staying engaged with your own patterns instead of hiding behind them. Noticing when detachment becomes avoidance, when independence becomes isolation, when strength becomes a reason not to feel. You don't need to rush toward connection or announce vulnerability to anyone, but you do need to stop assuming that distance is always wisdom, because wisdom adapts, it doesn't fossilize. And the same mind that learned to survive without love can learn to coexist with it without surrendering itself, if you allow curiosity to replace fear one moment at a time. This is not about chasing intimacy, it's about allowing space for it to exist without immediately managing it, explaining it, or neutralizing it. And if you feel resistance here, that resistance is not a failure. It's information, a signal pointing directly to the places where growth would matter most if you ever decided to pursue it. You're not being asked to change who you are, only to recognize that who you are was forged in absence, and that power lies in deciding whether absence will continue to be the architect of your future, or whether you will take that role yourself, quietly, deliberately, without spectacle. Love did not miss you because you were unworthy. It stayed away because you learned how to live without it so well that even its shadow learned to hesitate. Click on the screen to watch the next video on how this knowledge changes what happens next, what most people never realize after this moment, and what you will start seeing differently from now on.